Welcome to What is Going Om for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on Om Time's flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. There comes a time in many people's spiritual journeys when the reading, the studying, the teaching, and the training are no longer enough. What we want is evidence, a tangible spiritual experience, a lucid dream, an altered state of consciousness, a spine-chilling encounter with spirit, or, let's go for the big one, a conversation with God. It's not an unreasonable want. However, according to this week's guest, it's possibly a short-sighted one because most of us have already experienced transcendent moments and not realized their significance. Jonathan H. Ellerby has dedicated his life to understanding the spiritual world. A spiritual teacher, ceremonial leader, wellness expert, and leadership consultant for more than 25 years, he has a doctoral degree in comparative religion, training as a counselor and chaplain, ordination as an interfaith minister, and certification in a variety of intuitive and energy-based healing practices. The author of several well-received titles, Jonathan Ellerby joins me now to discuss his latest book, 7 Gateways of Spiritual Knowledge, Awakening to a Deeper Knowledge of Love, Life Balance, and God, in which he shares the 7 most common ways that people encounter the spiritual world so that we can identify when we're having a spiritual experience and embrace it as an opportunity for spiritual growth and healing. Jonathan Ellerby, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So you open the book with the question, what is a spiritual experience? And you immediately share a story about Pam, an elder and wisdom seeker. And you tell the story about how she lost her sight because of a diabetic condition. And one day you were sitting next to her at a ceremony and you didn't speak to her. But after 15 minutes, she turned and spoke to you and she knew who you were. And when you asked her, how did she know? She talked about how her vision, if you like, had changed with her condition. What I want to know is, would you say that what she was doing, reading your energy, was a spiritual experience?
Okay. So we're diving right into this question, which is, how do you define a spiritual experience? And maybe if you're willing to back up one step, we have to look at the word spiritual and how that's become complicated today. Can I take a moment to address that?
We can. We were going to address it later, but let's do it now.
Well, I think it's going to set up the answer because for a lot of people listening, there's a confusion that's emerged over the years because spirituality has become, I would argue, a verb, a noun, and an adjective, and they're not all the same thing. So let's just get this clarified first so that people have a framework for why the book is called Spiritual Experience and whether Pam was actually developing a spiritual gift. So the mistake, I would say, now this is my opinion, although everyone can use language the way they like. I think the thing that's become confusing is that we've started to use the word spiritual in exchange for a set of qualities that we hope spirituality will cultivate in people. So if someone is kind and someone is loving and someone is intuitive, we say they're spiritual. But if someone is psychic with a great gift for healing, but they're kind of a jerk, then we say, oh, I thought they were spiritual. Yeah. So in that sense, people are using the word spiritual to describe a certain set of characteristics or qualities. Now, sounds like a long answer, but this is important. Let's look at the physical body instead for a moment. I don't think we get to negotiate if we're physical or not. We're all physical. The real question is, are we physically fit? Are we physically adept? Are we physically engaged? And as in the case of athletes, are we physically intelligent? So let's return to spirituality. In the same way, everyone is spiritual. Spiritual for me means that everyone lives in relationship to the deep questions of life, whether they are conscious or unconscious of it. Who am I really? What matters most? Where are we going? Where did we come from? People listening to you may not think they have answers to the questions, but they have default answers. That frames their spirituality. But then spirituality can be a verb. It's the path, it's the practice, it's the active journey in relationship to those questions. And then ultimately, in an expanding relationship to life that means deeper dimensions of self and deeper dimensions of our relationships and our universe. And that would include the cosmic, the physical, the metaphysical, all these other things. So spirituality is also a process and a journey. And so there are certain categories of life that I personally associate with that ability to relate to the deeper dimensions. I actually call it spiritual intelligence. So much the way your athlete has certain aptitudes like coordination, balance, strength, and so on, we also have spiritual aptitudes. And there's this thing I refer to as spiritual intelligence. Now let's answer your question briefly. Yes, I believe that Pam was cultivating her spiritual intelligence, that her spiritual intelligence grew as other senses diminished. Now, did it make her a more spiritual person in the sense of being kinder, wiser, more loving? Well, in the case of Pam, it did. But Pam was already on the journey. Pam was already connected at a deeper level to her spiritual self. And so I hope this sort of deconstruction can help some people listening and maybe help them to recognize that they are already spiritual. The question is, are they on the journey intentionally? And are they cultivating the qualities they associate with the highest expressions of spiritual intelligence?
That's the point right there, because many people have, let's say, mystical experiences that they, cannot articulate and they have no frame of reference for. And they're not necessarily on a spiritual journey. So they don't know what to do with that. Then
Right.
there are other people on their spiritual journeys who are looking actively for those kinds of mystical experiences, as I said in the beginning, as evidence.
Right. And I think what you've just highlighted is a question, which is what makes an experience a spiritual experience? And I would suggest it is an experience that functions kind of like the book title as a potential gateway to a deeper relationship with self, with others, and with the world beyond this one. Now, if you think of it that way, then you may come to realize, hopefully by the end of this conversation or by the end of the book, that so many experiences in a day can be that powerful aha moment. And very often, just slowing down, being present, being attentive, and somewhat intentional in the sense of looking for or cultivating connection, it could really happen just about anywhere. And I mean, really, peeling carrots, pouring your coffee, walking your dog, even a car ride. And some people have had this experience. You can't quite explain how or why it happened, but that song came on that stirs your heart. For some reason, you just had a little less on your mind that afternoon, and all of a sudden, your worries and preoccupations disappeared. Something took you into the symphony of life. And it almost felt like the music and the people on the street were all in concert together. You could feel more, sense more, see more. And you're just catching a cab or driving to work. That's a great example of a spiritual experience that you don't necessarily expect, you don't need religion for, and yet, if you don't take the time to acknowledge it, to savor it, to integrate it, it can very often pass in the blink of an eye.
This is interesting because there are many people who are divided, who do this when as soon as they hear the word spiritual, they think it means, airy fairy, marshmallow, space cadets, all of those things. And certainly in a corporate arena, you couldn't say that word as comfortably as you could perhaps somewhere else. You work in the corporate arena quite a lot. And yet, what you've just described there, these transcendent moments, they can relate to. So we really do need a new word. We need a new word that crosses all of the different arenas, I think, so that people have a clear understanding of what we mean when we use that word.
I think so. It raises a couple of things I could comment on. The first of which is that I don't have that word yet, but I do often use the phrase spiritual intelligence because I find that in our culture, the Western culture, which is so mind and intellect oriented, the minute you tack the word intelligence onto something, they're curious, right? So emotional intelligence,
Yes.
physical intelligence,
Yeah.
spiritual intelligence.
Yeah.
And I would say, and I do have a kind of working model of it. I believe that spiritual intelligence has a mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual quality. And the core qualities, at least I offer for your listeners and viewers, it's our capacity for intuition, our capacity to sense and interact with energy, our capacity for connection, and the last word, depending on the audience, is our capacity to surrender, which is also faith or letting go. Now, why do I mention my definition of spiritual intelligence? Because in the leadership world, all of these things are critical for strong leaders to master over time. Do they trust their judgment beyond the facts? That's intuition. We call it business acumen. Can they read energy in people, right? And we say, well, that person's got good vibes, or he has a good sense of things, or she can feel, right? We use all these other words when we're talking about spiritual abilities. Connection, of course, in the business world is about building relationships and understanding the primacy of relationships over time. And finally, the word surrender, faith, letting go in the business world is actually about adaptability. And what you'll notice in many of the most successful business leaders in history is that they're courageous, they're willing to experiment, they're willing to pursue a vision, but they're also typically not rigid. They may be passionate, but they're more curious than certain. So you look at a company like Apple. I mean, I don't want to promote any brand in particular, or a company like Starbucks. I mean, these are two multinational brands. And what you'll observe behind their success was that they were always willing to let go of what wasn't working, willing to pick up what was, willing to try new things. And in a similar way, each and every one of us can benefit from these same qualities. Now, just let me conclude by saying that when I work in the business world, I don't use the word spirituality at all. However, I let them use it. So I may do a class or a course or a training around organizational culture or emotional intelligence. And at some point, almost always, someone will put their hand up and say, well, that's really kind of spiritual, isn't it? And I'll smile knowingly and say, well, yeah, I guess so. I didn't really think about that.
Yeah. There's there's a lot of avenues around this word spiritual that we could discuss, but I really want to talk more about what's in your book. But before we do that, what was your first transcendent experience?
That's a fabulous experience question. So at the risk of sounding cliche, I do believe that children are all frequently having what I would call spiritual experiences, in the sense that they are still forming boundaries. They are not yet limited or fixed in their mental constructs of the world. And so imagination, creativity, open-mindedness, and open-heartedness are typically still present for most children. And in that way, they're interacting in the world in a kind of magical way. Now, what typically happens for most of us, including your listeners and viewers who felt like they were once very spiritual and then somehow lost it. That's a common thing I hear in my coaching work. Typically, as we start to move towards adolescence, and that can be as young as 10, 11, 12, we start to compare ourselves to others. We start to try to understand what it means to fit in. We start to crave the conditioning of the world around us. You know, a lot of people have a lot of negative ideas about culture and ego and how it controls us, but we also craved it at one point. We wanted to make sense of our world. We wanted models of reality. And then typically that's when people start to let go of whatever is not celebrated or talked about or endorsed. So if there's no talk of spirits or no talk of energy or no talk of consciousness, well, it goes out the window. For me, I would say a pivotal earliest moment that I could point to beyond the kind of unconscious magic that I experienced as a child was probably around the age of 10, 11. I think it was the summer I turned 11. And it was pretty simple. I remember I was walking through a forest in a quite a remote wilderness area. My family, it's a long story, but my family has a cabin on a lake, on an island, you know, one of those sort of Canadian things. And I was off. I'd gone by boat to an island that's not inhabited by people. And for the first time, I remember walking from one grove of trees into a cedar forest. And there was something, I would say, palpable, visceral, meaning almost tactile, in the transition from one area to another. And I became aware of this thing that I would now call energy. It was clear to me that the energy of one set of trees or plants was different than another. And that wasn't just about the appearance or the lighting. It felt real. It felt as real as the bark on the tree. And in that moment, I could feel, or I had the perception that I could feel it interacting with me. That one stand of trees resonates with my body and delivers one message or experience, as does another. Now, fast forward, we now know that traditional cultures have long taught that herbal medicine, and this is all over the world, of course, that herbal medicine is not just about the phytochemicals in the plants, but that plants themselves have energetic signatures. And that what I thought I was experiencing at that young age is actually a very, very old way of relating to the physical world, as though it were alive and as though it were interacting with us at a subtle energy level. That was probably the first self-aware moment. And I started to say, wait a second, what is this always happening? Is energy everywhere? And what is the presence I feel inside the energy? And that took me on the next step of the journey.
So is it a direct result of that experience that you went off and you traveled so much and you've done so much training with so many different cultures and indigenous, you know, shamans?
Yeah, well, it was it did start the process because I think, you know, before I was overly self-aware or even conscientious of what might be inappropriate, right? Because I was too young to be, I guess, self-conscious in some ways. I started to read whatever I could. I started to, you know, self-experiment with guided meditations, and I mean anything I could get my hands on in the spiritual world as a teenager. That was my passion, right? Day and night. I stayed up late reading and writing and reading and writing. And the interesting thing, and I do believe this is true, and it is a mechanism of the spiritual world, what you put into it directly activates what shows up for you. In other words, the further I went, the more I experienced. The more I opened myself to experience, the more experiences I had, the more experts I talked to, not just knowledge, but again, the more experiences that came to me. Um, and it I don't know if the word is snowballed, but it just continued because each phenomena, each experience not only was a pleasure and felt healing and fulfilling, so there was a great craving there, but it was also like unraveling a mystery. And I'll tell you, actually, I don't know if I normally would say this or I feel comfortable because it does sound a little bit psychotic, but I truly came to believe at a young age that there is an obvious hidden design to our world. And if we can observe it on the physical level through Newtonian and atomic and quantum and now high energy physics, then why wouldn't we be able to ascertain a similar design on a subtle level? And that's really what's happening in the world today. We've revealed patterns of mind and psychology, patterns of mood and emotion. We've revealed patterns in the astrophysical and subtle physical realms. And I think we're beginning to understand that spirituality is not competitive, that these various systems around the world, including religious traditions, can help us to discern a living design that we are all a part of.
But, going back to religion, why has it been okay to be religious, but not okay to be spiritual in so many different cultures?
Right. Well, I have a complex answer to this question if I can take some time. I think it's an important question. Religion and spirituality. What the heck? So let's start off with the upside of religion because most people in a show like this are not quick to talk about that. Um, and by the way, I should tell you, I've lived a lot of places where it's more permissible to be spiritual than to be religious. So it's always an opposition in general, though. So the beauty of religion is that because spirituality is about a living personal relationship with an infinite world of endless dimensions, it's helpful to have a container. In its highest form, religion provides us a body of knowledge to organize our thoughts and experiences. It provides us practices, right? So, rituals, prayers, things to actually do to facilitate spiritual experience and allow us to integrate the knowledge. It provides us with community, other people doing the same thing, going in the same direction. Very important for anything that we want to achieve in life. And it provides us with guides, mentors, teachers, leaders, people who've done the work, gained the credibility, and can support the system of philosophy, practice, and people. The problem, however, is that people are people, and we always have been, which means that as much as we are physical and spiritual, we are also emotional. And emotional means that we are fearful, we are self protecting, we want to ensure our success very often at the expense of others or at the exclusion of others. And so, what we've seen over time is not religion as a problem in the world, but people's abuse of religion as a problem. And of course, I don't need to elaborate a lot on that. In many settings, religion has become a vehicle of oppression, of genocide, of cultural extinction, of intellectual opposition. I mean, people have used religion in pretty horrific ways. However, that's people, that's not religion. People have used science in horrific ways. People have used love in horrific ways. People have used food and sex and art in horrific ways. So, an unhealthy person will corrupt what they're involved with. So, let's have a little respect for religion. On the other hand, there is a problem we are facing in the world today, and I do believe it reflects the story of human evolution. Now, I'm going to try to do this briefly. But for me, I look at the stages of existence itself as unfolding first in the era of what I would call mystery. So we all know that there is a mystery that we come from. Some call it the Big Bang, some string theory, some the faceless, presence of God before all things. I don't care what you call it, it's a mystery. Knowing that we come from a mystery is important because that means we must honor mystery today and accept that we can't control and know all things. But the next phase that showed up was the natural phase, where there were no people. It was only nature, planets forming, stars forming, eventually the earth forming, dinosaurs, the whole deal, until people show up. And the value of acknowledging this phase is that it reminds us that nature has been unfolding according to a magnificent and elegant design, however you explain its origin. And that design is still unfolding today. So we are made of stars, quite literally, and we can live in accordance or harmony or cooperation with natural design, and that's when we prosper. Now, here's the last few parts, I think pretty important. In the early era of human culture, which was really from roughly 60,000 years ago, when we talk about material culture and cave paintings and signs of human spirituality and so on, until about 500 BCE, we saw a very flat, horizontal human world, meaning it was very relational, very circular, very community focused. Some would call it feminine. Now, it doesn't mean everyone was always nice, and it doesn't mean women were always treated well, but there was a feminine quality to those cultures. They were relationship centric, relationship to the land, the earth, the animals, and the spirit world wasn't high above, it was living among them. Eventually, around 500 BCE, we saw a massive, sudden, and really unexplainable phenomena, which is in about a 700-year window. We saw what Teilhard de Chardin, a great scholar of world religions, called the rise of the axial period. And all of a sudden, everything stratifies, it goes up. The Buddha talks about transcendence. Jesus talks about salvation. Confucius, Socrates, all these great masters show up, and they're now talking vertical, not horizontal. Leave the family and community behind. You can get there on your own. So individualism in spirituality is born, and hierarchy in society rises and eventually begins to take over. Now, do you have a minute for the conclusion?
Well, let me just check the time. Yes, we've got a minute for the conclusion.
All right. So what we see then is the growth of what we might call a masculine era. Now, the masculine era is not all wrong or bad unless it goes without the balance of the feminine. So what does it look like? It looks like conquest. It looks like aggressive innovation. It looks like war. It looks like unfettered development. And it's given us endless gifts: science, medicine, some of the positive sides of globalization, but it's also given us colonization and systematic oppression and, economic disparity. It's the toxic masculine extreme. So what does this have to do with our conversation? Well, in that era, religion took on those same qualities and became what I would call masculine in its primary expression: controlling, dominating, colonizing, othering. But we are today, and I mean it, your show is such an important part of this. We are now moving to this next era, where all of these four phases must come together as one, or we will not survive as a species on the planet. And so we must restore our relationship to the spiritual world, to the magical, to the creative, to the feminine, and honor the strength of the masculine society and culture, but lose its painful extremes. So I'll leave it at that for now.
That's very, very interesting description. But we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is author, speaker, spiritual teacher, ceremonial leader, and wellness expert, Jonathan Ellerby. And we're talking about his latest book, 7 Gateways of Spiritual Experience, Awakening to a Deeper Knowledge of Love, Life Balance, and God, in which he shares the 7 most common ways that people encounter the spiritual world. We'll be back with more from Jonathan Ellerby in just a few moments, so don't go away.
Times TV.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of Times flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And as an author, editor, and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked, what's really worth reading and what's not? So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who've walked this path before you. There's no catch, no fees, and no BS. Just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these 3 levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those 3 levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the siddhi. And the siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Jonathan Ellerby. Let's take a look at these 7 gateways of spiritual experience. The first one that you list is the experience of truth and beauty. Tell me about that.
I was just looking at my own book.
You've got it back to front. Always we're seeing it back to front.
Yes. So, okay. So qualifying the 7 experiences that are outlined in this book I sort of like to describe for people as you might want to visualize them in a pyramid, starting with the widest at the bottom. That's the first type of experience. And then it moves up to the final type. Now, what earns a spiritual experience a place in the pyramid is the fact that it's universal, it's pervasive. We see it in cultures around the world. It's virtually available to all people. However, they are not all as common as each other. So at the top of the pyramid, and it's not meant to be, actually, this is the point and my answer to your question, it doesn't necessarily mean that the quote highest experience is the best or most important. They're all important. They all teach different things. Some are just more unusual, some are more common. Now, the experience of truth and beauty is the foundation of this pyramid. It is something that we can encounter almost every day, depending on the moment of life that we're in. And yet, I would say it's just as important, maybe more, than the highest, most unusual spiritual experience we find at the top of the pyramid. Experiences of truth and beauty are simply little aha moments, or even moments, moments of wonder or awe or connectedness that break through in an ordinary setting on an ordinary day. We're not necessarily at church. We're not necessarily doing yoga. We're not off on some grand adventure to find ourselves or know the world. We're it's a bit like the story I told earlier. We're on a bus to the museum, or we're at the museum, or maybe we're having a lunch with friends on a patio and they excuse themselves to go to the restroom. And, for a moment, we're not on our phone. We don't have to be somewhere. No one's asking for something from us. And the sunlight catches the ice in our water glass. And we notice the light dancing across the surface. And in just an unexplainable moment, we're enraptured with the beauty, and we suddenly forget our problems. We feel an expansiveness in some strange way in that moment. World feels okay. And then they come back from the restroom and we get back to lunch and complaining about everything in our lives. So these little moments can be 30 seconds, a minute. And typically they arise from a present moment experience of something ordinary that connects us to a fuller, more expansive sense of self and the world.
These are probably the ones that are most likely to be forgotten about, dismissed, not necessarily acknowledged as a spiritual experience.
Right. And what's so important about that comment or observation is that if you imagine each spiritual experience as a kind of gem, what if you collected all those little gems? It's not a big diamond, it's a little one. It's not a big ruby, it's a fragment of one. But you collected them all and you strung them all. We would all have, garlands of jewels upon us. If we wait and wait and wait for that one big experience that we read about once or we saw in a movie, we're waiting for the big, the hope diamond to hang around our neck,
With God.
right? And then be spiritual for the rest of our lives. A lot of
Yeah.
us will go without much at all. So yes, we must collect these precious little moments and not dismiss them or let them go by.
Yeah, yeah. And the second one is the experience of what you call ordinary magic.
Yeah, so ordinary magic, what it's kind of a paradoxical phrase. The idea is we all either have experienced or know people who've experienced unexplainable physical phenomena in ordinary settings. So these are often called miracles, although I would include synchronicities in this category. So it's an ordinary setting, again, in the sense that you're not in a place of worship. It's not a religious or explicitly spiritual setting, but something unexplainable and yet undeniable occurs. Someone has a terrible accident. They're in a coma, maybe even pronounced dead, and unexplainably, they come back. Or in fact, I've lived through experiences like this. In fact, I write about one of them well, I write a little bit about a healing experience I had in two of my books, Spiritual Experience and Return to the Sacred. Um, but I had a physical condition that I was born with in my feet and my legs. And as a teenager, we had been to specialists and surgeons looking for some way to correct this problem. It made it very, eventually, I had to drop out of sports. It made it painful to run, difficult to walk long distances. And and all the interventions in the Western world were so dramatic and aggressive, breaking bones, rewiring. So I decided to pursue traditional indigenous healing methods. Long story why that was my choice, but anyways, I did. And in the end, it was what they would call a spirit calling ceremony. Effectively, from a Western perspective, nothing happened in there except singing and praying and some spooky behavior in the dark. But what we know, or what I believe and know from an energetic perspective, is that an incredible power was evoked and applied with precision, and it quite literally changed my physiology and my life. And still to this day, over 30 years later, I run, I exercise, I'm as able as anyone with no physical intervention. That's ordinary magic. Um, and
Did you believe
yeah,
going into that you would be cured? Did you believe it?
okay, this is a profound question. What I've learned is that belief is a mechanism to engage the energetic realm. I didn't feel convinced when I went into it, and I wasn't sure I believed, but I had a very powerful moment in that ceremony. It was right at the beginning, and you may even know the story.
Mm.
One of the helpers to the traditional healer, what sort of white folks would probably call a shaman, he came over to me, and this was in an all native community. I was the only sort of white guy around, and I don't know that everyone then there was like happy I was there, but when called to heal and called to work as a community, the community comes together. So they were there. I was the primary focus of this ceremony. This fellow came over, not in the kindest bedside manner kind of way, and he got really close up into my face and he said to me, "I don't know you. I don't know where you come from. I don't know what you believe. And I don't know what you think is going to happen tonight. But as soon as the lights go out, because this ceremony happens in the dark," he said, "there's no room for doubt. You must believe, as we do, that this is possible and this will happen." And then he adds, "And if you don't, someone could get hurt." And then he got up and left, and I thought, oh my gosh, what is he talking about? So the point is, I simply committed myself to the absolute positive affirmative focus on what was happening. Was that a mechanism in the healing? Probably. Was that the only mechanism in the healing? Probably not, because the same healer works with multiple people and achieves extraordinary results on a regular basis. So we're not all believing in the exact same way. But yes, belief is absolutely a mechanism to engage ordinary magic and invoke spiritual experience.
Yeah. And it is a fascinating story. And in fact, the book is full of them. There are so many fascinating stories in there. So tell us about the experience of the spirit world. This is the one that everyone is, where they want to go after they've done all the reading and the training.
Right. So the third category is spirit world, which I guess in modern parlance would be called the paranormal. So psychic phenomena, paranormal experiences, ghost spirits, this is the realm we're talking about. However, I like to define it a little more broadly. The spirit world is any encounter of a being beyond this world. So that could be ghosts and ancestors and spirit guides, but I would include experiences of Jesus or Krishna or the Buddha. If it's got an identity, and it's not in a body, I mean, being a little playful, to me, that's a spirit world experience.
Mm. Yeah. How common is that?
Well, I think it's actually quite common. Now, I've tried to get, it's interesting to try to find statistics because, of course, different research sources are very, they're going to prove what they want to prove, right? However, we do know, at least through sociological research, and I'd say fairly reliable research, that a majority of people, virtually everywhere, but we could just talk about the West, a majority of people do believe in the spirit world. They don't necessarily understand it or can't explain it or articulate it, but they believe there's, quote, something out there. What I have found in speaking to audiences, I don't do this much lately, but I used to much more when I was traveling, back in the days where people traveled to talk about their books. I'd ask people to close their eyes. And I would even do this with physician groups or, scientists. And I'd say, if you have personally had an unexplainable direct experience of something that felt like a spirit or a being or someone deceased, or someone very close to you is absolutely convinced that they have, put your hand up. There's no question, most of the time, over half the room puts their hand up.
Yeah.
But like so many experiences in life, if you don't have a container for it, language for it, a chance to integrate it or make sense of it, we let it go. We move on. But particularly around death, we see this very frequently. Just before people die, visions of relatives, ancestors, pronounced dreams. I worked in a hospital for years and worked in end-of-life care. Very, very, very common amongst both patients and staff.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things in your book that really interested me was, we're talking about belief. There was a time when you were working in the hospital where a doctor, Dr. Carl, really vehemently was against something that you were putting into practice that involved alternative complementary medicine. And you spoke to him, you ended up giving him all of the research, reams and reams of it. And he had to admit in the end that he actually didn't want
Yes.
to believe. Now, that in itself is a belief, because he knew that if he did believe it, he's got to change something.
Yes. It's such an important story, actually, because going back to what we talked about before the break, this is the cost of this contemporary Western extreme. You could call it vertical consciousness. I call it masculine, not necessarily about men, but we've moved to this place where many people are actually afraid of or resistant to
Yes.
things that are frankly natural and universal. That really is the reason why I wanted to walk through that evolutionary story. And Dr. Carl was the perfect example. He came to know and trust and love his world of science, but ironically wasn't very scientific about it. I think it's Houston Smith, a great scholar of world religion. He calls that belief style scientism, the unwillingness to look beyond the material and that which science cannot prove. And of course, almost everything that we take for granted today once was beyond the purview of science. And as science grows more sophisticated, well, what we once thought was impossible becomes possible. And similarly, we find that as science becomes more sophisticated, it reveals dimensions of reality that are much, much more like what our mystics, sages, saints, and shamans have been teaching us for generations.
Yeah. 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 I do find it so fascinating that people will not change their opinion because they're absolutely convinced it's going to be bad for them.
Right. So there's a little secret here I can share with listeners. Any belief that we are unwilling to consider, adapt, or at least look at is a belief that's being held in place by an emotion. So take this awareness that if something threatens you, if you feel you can't let go of something, if you want to be free, if you want to be happy, look there. Because the emotion that's holding it in place is probably fear. And there's really typically only a couple of reasons why we're so afraid to let go of beliefs. One is it was put in place with pain. We picked up that belief because we were hurt, we were wounded, we were victimized, whatever, or we have come to identify with the belief. And that means that belief and who we think we are at our core are so enmeshed, so mixed, so identified that we are actually subconsciously afraid that if we give up the belief, we give up ourselves. It's scarier than dying.
Yes.
But we are so much more than our thoughts and our ideas and even our emotions. And that's one of the beautiful gifts of this spiritual journey and the book and your show, which is to remind people we are more than anything that's been done to us. We are more than anything we've lived through. And we are even more than the beliefs we carry.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and
know.
I won't be able to go through the rest of them. You have exercises after many of the chapters. There's one that I wanted to talk about, but we don't have time, which people will be very interested in. And that's the one where you show people how they can actually get information. They can actually ask questions.
Mm.
They will get answers. And I think that's brilliant. You know, the way you've planned that out is very useful to people. And I would encourage people to read the book and do that exercise. But before we go, what I do want to ask you is, what is the meaning and the purpose of a spiritual experience?
Oh, in just a few minutes.
Well, yeah, in about, one.
What I would say is that each type of spiritual experience does deliver a different kind of meaning. Each one teaches us, I think, in some way, a different facet of our world and what it means to be human. So we could generalize and say spiritual experiences are about helping us to see the fullness of our world, the fullness of who we are, and it's a big phrase, but the transcendent nature of being. In other words, what they all have in common is they leave us with this big picture feeling, this sense that we are something that endures
Yes.
beyond this life. They leave us with a sense of connectedness. They leave us with a sense of hope and love and the awareness that wisdom is always available to us. Those are some of the things that I think cut across all the spiritual experiences. And ultimately, that would be the purpose of pursuing them, to feel more fulfilled, more resilient, I dare say happier, and more connected in this life.
Yeah, there's something about having an experience that makes you think there is something there that is so much bigger than I, that really does resonate very, very deeply with us.
It's interesting that all the research, whether it was William James, back at the turn of the previous century, or whether it's Andrew Newberg, a famous American neurologist, all the research into the nature of spiritual experience reveals certain core qualities, and one of which is the experience feels more real than ordinary life. And what you just described is one of those feelings that people feel that this greater reality is the way we should be looking at life, is the backstory for each one of us. The story of the cosmos is our story. Our life doesn't begin with a broken family or not having enough money or being corrupted by too much privilege. No, our story begins with mystery. And it explodes magically through the story of stars and black holes, the majesty of a blue whale and the elegance of a hummingbird, all this
I'm
beauty.
going to have to interrupt you here, Jonathan. I'm loving everything that you're saying, but we're going to run out of time, and I don't want to do that.
Well, this is who we are, and I'm
Thank
grateful to share it.
you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We've been discussing 7 gateways of spiritual experience, awakening to a deeper knowledge of love, life balance, and God with Jonathan Ellerby. The book is published by Findhorn Press, Division of Inner Traditions. And if you want more information about Jonathan Ellerby's books, podcast, weekly classes, and coaching services, and his events, visit his website, jonathanellerby.com. That's it for this week. I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me. And thank you again to Jonathan Ellerby.
Thank you.